You've heard about Walt. Now let me properly introduce the other man from that story, the one I've mentioned in passing but never actually told you about. Because his story is, in some ways, more unsettling than Walt's, and I've been saving it deliberately, because I wanted you to sit with Walt's story on its own first, without the comparison undercutting it too early. Walt failed by trying too hard at the wrong thing, for 31 consistent years. This man barely tried at anything financial at all, and still won, by a distance that isn't close, without ever once thinking of himself as disciplined, without ever once being praised by anyone at that plant for his handling of money, without ever once deserving, by the standards everyone around him used, to be the one who came out ahead. In The Frugal Trap, I told you Walt's coworker put 12% of every paycheck into an index fund and never touched it. That was one sentence, buried in a much longer story about Walt's 31 years of exactingly correct behavior aimed at the wrong target. Today, that one sentence is the entire story, because on its own, examined closely instead of used as a footnote, it turns out to be the more important lesson of the two. I'll call him Earl. Earl ate out constantly, 3, sometimes 4 nights a week, at the diner 2 towns over that Walt would have considered an extravagance reserved for anniversaries. Earl never once, as far as anyone who knew him could tell, clipped a coupon in his life. He financed a boat he used maybe 6 times a summer, paid it off slower than he needed to because he liked having the payment as an excuse to check in on it. By every measure the plant and the neighborhood used to judge Walt as the responsible one, Earl would have failed the test badly, and everyone, including Earl himself, would have agreed with the grade. Here's what nobody, including Earl, thought to track: the week he started at the plant, 22 years old, filling out a stack of new hire paperwork he mostly wasn't reading closely, Earl signed a form that moved 12% of every paycheck automatically into an index fund. He doesn't remember making a considered decision. He remembers wanting to get through the paperwork and go to lunch. Someone in HR had defaulted the enrollment box to checked, and Earl, by his own account, simply didn't uncheck it. Then he forgot about it. Not figuratively, genuinely forgot. Decades later, when I asked him directly what had made him decide to invest 12% of his income starting at 22, he had to think for a real, uncomfortable moment before he even remembered signing anything at all. It had become invisible to him the way your own heartbeat is invisible to you, running constantly, doing the entire job, without ever once requiring his conscious attention to keep going. He kept spending the way he wanted to spend on everything else, for the next 31 years. He never optimized a single receipt in his life. He never built a spreadsheet, 11 columns or 1. And when I finally sat down with both his numbers and Walt's, side by side, decades later, Earl had ended up with more by a distance that isn't close, more despite eating out 4 nights a week for 3 decades, more despite the boat, more despite never once trying to be the responsible one in any conversation at the plant. I want you to notice something about the size of Earl's total effort here. 1 form. 1 checked box he didn't even choose to check. 0 maintenance for 31 years. Compare that to Walt's 31 years of coupons, of price comparisons, of a ledger updated with real discipline every single week. Earl's total financial effort, measured in hours spent thinking about money, might be the smallest number in this entire series, and it still outperformed the largest one. I asked Earl once, near the end of his career, whether he ever thought about increasing that 12%, now that he understood what it had done for him. He said he'd thought about it exactly once, a few years back, then forgot to actually do it, the same way he'd forgotten to uncheck the original box 30 years earlier. He wasn't being falsely modest. That was genuinely who Earl was with money, not strategic, not reflective, just permanently, reliably out of the way of a system that had been left alone to do its job. I've thought about that conversation more than almost any other in this series, because it's the clearest example I've ever seen of a good outcome that required the person to do almost nothing right, as long as they'd already done the one thing that mattered. One more detail from Earl's file, because it's the one that convinced me his story wasn't an accident dressed up as evidence, it was the real thing. Earl worked the same line at that plant for 31 years, never chasing a supervisor's job, never angling for a transfer to something better paying, content in a way some of his coworkers found almost strange to watch. A man on that same floor, decades later, still remembered Earl as the guy who always had somewhere to be for dinner, never the guy anyone would have singled out for financial foresight. That's not incidental color. It's the whole picture. Nothing about Earl, on any given ordinary Tuesday at that plant, signaled that he was quietly winning a 31-year contest nobody else in the building knew was being run. There's a boat detail I left out, because it's worth its own moment. Earl kept that boat in a modest marina slip 2 towns from the plant, paid for in full every month regardless of whether he'd used it that season, and when a coworker once asked why he kept paying for something he barely used, Earl reportedly just shrugged and said he liked knowing it was there. That's a spending decision Walt would have flagged instantly as wasteful, and by a narrow accounting logic, he wouldn't have been wrong. But it's worth noticing what that shrug actually cost Earl, set against everything else running quietly in the background: nothing. The boat payment and the 12% were never competing for the same dollar in any way that mattered, because the 12% had already been taken off the top, automatically, before Earl ever got a chance to decide the boat wasn't worth it. Here's what makes Earl's story genuinely uncomfortable, and I'm not going to soften it to make it easier to hear: this isn't a story about virtue winning. Walt was the more virtuous man, by almost any standard people actually use to judge each other, more careful, more disciplined, more responsible looking at every single decision point along the way, for 3 decades. Earl won anyway. Not because carelessness is secretly good, and not because virtue doesn't matter. Because the one decision Earl made, almost by accident, was aimed at the correct ledger, and the 100 decisions Walt made, all deliberately, were all aimed at the wrong one. The myth this series keeps circling back to, in different clothes each time, is that the total amount of virtue on display determines the financial outcome. It doesn't. The ledger determines the outcome. Virtue aimed at the wrong ledger loses to a single correct decision aimed at the right one, almost every time, over a long enough horizon, and 31 years is more than long enough for that gap to become undeniable. I think this is uncomfortable for a specific reason. It means the story we tell ourselves about deserving financial success, that it rewards the person who tries hardest, who sacrifices the most visibly, who other people would point to as the responsible one at a dinner party, isn't reliably true. It rewards aim. Effort without aim doesn't get partial credit here, no matter how sincere or sustained it is, and that's a harder thing to accept than almost anything else in this series. I think about the dinner parties Walt and Earl might both have attended, decades apart, and which of them the room would have called the responsible one without a second thought. It would have been Walt, every time, unanimously. That instinct, the one that reads visible sacrifice as financial virtue, isn't wrong about sacrifice. It's wrong about which sacrifice actually compounds into anything. Earl would have looked, at every single dinner party for 31 years, like the man who wasn't taking his future seriously. He was taking it more seriously than almost anyone in the room. He'd just already finished the one decision that mattered and never mentioned it, because to him, it wasn't a decision anymore. It was just a number on a paycheck he'd stopped noticing. I've had more conversations about Earl than almost any other figure in this series, and the ones that stick with me are the people who get uncomfortable partway through, the way I suspect some of you are right now. They want there to be a hidden virtue in Earl somewhere, a secret frugality, a private spreadsheet nobody knew about, something that would let the story make the sense they expect a financial success story to make. There isn't one. I've looked. Earl really did spend close to everything else he made, on a boat he barely used and dinners he didn't need, for 3 decades, and the story still doesn't rescue Walt's version of discipline. That discomfort you're feeling is the point, not a bug in how I'm telling it. I want to head off the wrong lesson here, because it's an easy one to take from a story like Earl's, and I've watched people take it. Earl doesn't prove that spending freely is smart, or that discipline doesn't matter, or that you can coast your way to a comfortable retirement on luck alone. Earl had one enormous piece of discipline, and I don't want it to get lost in the story. He never touched that 12%. Not once. Not during any downturn he lived through, not for the boat, not for a single one of those 4-nights-a-week dinners, not for anything, across 31 years. That single act of restraint, sustained without interruption for 3 decades, is still real discipline. It's just discipline aimed at one high-leverage decision instead of scattered across 1,000 small ones. It's actually a harder kind of discipline in one specific way. It required no daily willpower at all, because the automation did the resisting for him. He never had to decide, on any given Tuesday, not to redirect that money. The system had already decided for him, permanently, the week he signed the form. So if you're tempted to walk away from this story thinking, I'll just relax and stop trying, the way Earl did, you've actually missed the one thing Earl did that mattered most. He didn't relax on the 12%. He relaxed on everything else, which is a completely different, much more specific instruction than the general one people tend to hear. Put the two men's total decision count side by side and the picture gets even sharper. Walt made what might be thousands of small financial decisions over 31 years, every coupon, every price comparison, every dollar deliberately not spent. Earl made one. If discipline were simply additive, if every disciplined decision counted equally toward the outcome regardless of target, Walt should have won by an enormous margin. He didn't win at all. That's the clearest evidence in this entire series that the count of disciplined decisions matters far less than where a single one of them is aimed. Picture the two records side by side, because the shape of the difference matters as much as the outcome. Walt's file, if you could see it, would be an actual drawer of paper, 31 years of small receipts, coupons stapled to grocery slips, a ledger line for nearly every transaction he ever made, thick enough that it would take you an afternoon just to page through one representative year of it. Earl's file is a single sheet, signed once, 22 years old, HR's default box left checked in blue ink he didn't linger over. One drawer. One sheet. If you had to guess, from the size of those two files alone, which man came out ahead financially, you would guess wrong, and you would guess wrong with total confidence, because the size of the file was never the thing that mattered. Only where the paper pointed was. So the real comparison here isn't disciplined Walt versus undisciplined Earl, that framing, which is the one most people default to instantly, is simply wrong, and it's the framing that makes Earl's story feel like luck instead of a lesson. It's misdirected discipline versus concentrated discipline. Earl needed far less total discipline than Walt did, across his entire life, because he spent what little he had in the one place where a small amount, applied exactly once, permanently outweighs a large amount applied everywhere else, forever, no matter how sincerely or consistently that larger amount is applied. It's worth saying plainly, because it's easy to hear concentrated discipline and think it means something rare or gifted, available only to people who get lucky with an HR form. It isn't. Concentrated discipline is available to anyone willing to make one correct decision and then, critically, get out of its way for a long time. That second half is the part people underrate, not the deciding, the leaving alone. Walt could have made Earl's exact decision at any point across those 31 years and layered it on top of everything else he was already doing. He never did, because his attention, his real discipline, his actual willpower, was entirely spent on a ledger that was never going to get him there, no matter how carefully he kept it. It also means the fix was never about becoming more disciplined than Walt, which is a discouraging goal for most people, because Walt's discipline, in its specific form, was already remarkable. Nobody watching this needs convincing that willpower is hard to sustain for 31 years. It's about redirecting a much smaller amount of the discipline you already have toward the one decision that's actually load-bearing, instead of spreading it thin across 100 decisions that don't compound the same way. You don't need Earl's luck, and you don't need Walt's stamina. You need one form, signed once, aimed deliberately at the right ledger instead of accidentally like Earl's was, and then 31 years of getting out of its own way. There's an objection worth taking seriously here, because it's the reasonable one, and I don't want to wave it away. Wasn't Earl just lucky? An HR default box, checked without thinking, isn't that luck dressed up as a lesson, something you can't actually build a strategy around? It's a fair question, and the honest answer is, the box being checked by default was luck. What happened for the next 31 years wasn't. Plenty of people have had a default enrollment box checked for them and unchecked at the first month, once they noticed the smaller number on their paycheck. Earl didn't. That part, the not touching it, for 31 consecutive years, through every reason he could have found to stop, was the discipline, and it was entirely his. Here's how to actually use this: instead of just admiring it from a distance, you don't need an HR department to default you into anything. You can build Earl's exact advantage on purpose, deliberately, this week, using the same automatic transfer from an earlier video in this series. The luck isn't required. Only the one decision is, and unlike Earl, you get to make yours on purpose, with your eyes open, instead of by accident while trying to get through new hire paperwork before lunch. What you can't shortcut is the second half, the 31 years of not touching it. That part doesn't come from a form. It comes from the same automation working quietly in the background, removing the decision from your hands on the days you might have talked yourself out of it. Earl didn't outdiscipline Walt by trying harder in the moment. He outdisciplined Walt by needing the moment to matter less, over and over, for 3 decades. And if you're worried you've already missed your version of Earl's 22-year-old moment, you haven't. Earl's advantage wasn't being young when he started, though that helped. It was the 31 years of not interfering that followed. You can start that clock today, at whatever age you're watching this, and the only thing standing between you and Earl's outcome, scaled to your own timeline, is making the one decision on purpose that he happened to make by accident. One more piece of advice, specifically for anyone doing the math right now on how many of their own years are already gone. It doesn't work the way you're probably calculating it. You're not comparing yourself to Earl at 22. You're comparing the next 31 years of your life, starting from today, to a version of yourself who waits even one more year to set the transfer up. That's the only comparison that's actually available to you, and against that comparison, today is always the best day you have. Not because today is special. Because every day you don't automate the decision is a day identical in cost to every other day you don't, and none of those days come back, no matter how many of them you're tempted to spend deciding instead of starting. Which raises the bigger question, the one I actually want to spend real time on next: where did we all learn to admire Walt's kind of discipline over Earl's? Why does a full ledger of careful daily sacrifice look more responsible to us than one quiet, correct decision made once and left alone? That's not an accident, and it's not obvious once you start looking at it directly. That's inherited, from people who meant well, teaching a scoreboard that made sense for a different, older, more bounded kind of life than the one most of us are actually living now. Next time, I want to zoom all the way out and talk about where that scoreboard came from, who handed it to you, and why it's still shaping decisions today that it was never built to guide, and understanding that inheritance is the first step toward choosing, on purpose, which parts of it are still worth keeping.